some to my UU life because I was raised Unitarian before the merger. Actually, my father died when I was 3, and not long after that, I remember being 4 in a Christmas pageant at the Unitarian Church with my mother, and then she remarried when I was 5, and so I had this whole new family, and we all went to the Unitarian Church. And when we did the curriculum on the church around the corner, the church across the street, I wanted to convert to anything. I did not like being a UU kid. I didn't feel as though I belonged. Everybody else went to this little Protestant church around the corner, and we went to this strange church where we didn't know what we believed. And so I felt a little like an outsider. But by the time I got to high school and we were talking about, my church was more about social justice than about spiritual growth, which I think was not unusual back in that day and age. But so in high school, I finally ended up getting together with a bunch of kids who really liked talking about ideas and politics and all that stuff. We called ourselves Midas, which was Mutual Intellectual Discussion for the Advancement of Society. So I started to learn to love to be UU, but then, like most people, when I went to college, I just gave it up. I didn't go to church at all. And my social justice background had me out on the streets. I mean, I started college in 1962 when we still wore girdles and stockings to class. And I didn't graduate until 68 for reasons that I'll explain a little bit. And in 1968, we weren't wearing bras. We didn't have to sign out. You could go sleep in anybody's room. The world had changed, not as much as it's changed in this last week, but the world between 1962 and 68 was completely different. And I spent a lot of time with, there was a social worker in Boston named Noel Day. And he had an idea that if he could train volunteers in what it was like to grow up Black in America, that we would be better volunteers at the settlement house where he wanted us to volunteer. So I had this transformative experience in 1962, 63 about realizing that the promise that I had grown up believing in, that everybody had equal opportunity, was totally not true. And so we were out on the streets registering voters and boycotting Wonder Bread because they wouldn't hire African Americans. And some of my friends went to Mississippi in the summer of 1964 and 65 to register voters and faced all of that stuff. I didn't because it being the 60s, I got pregnant, had to drop out of school. So, and I gave my child up for adoption, which was the hardest thing I've ever done. So then I went back to college. Back in those days, this was a total disgrace. You weren't supposed to do this. And it was a disgrace for the family. And it was a deep, dark secret. And nobody in my family knew except my mother and my father. But so I went back to college, not talking about it, totally depressed, really not sure what I wanted to do. And in the spring, in May of 1966, I was sitting next to a friend at in a psychology class, and she said, you know, the guys who signed up to go to Tanzania aren't going to be able to go because they would get drafted if they dropped out of school. She said, do you want to go to Tanzania for a year? And I said, sure, why not? And so 3 weeks later, I was in Dar es Salaam teaching at a school for refugees from Southern Africa. English was the only common language because these guys came from Southwest Africa, South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Zimbabwe. And the only common language was English. And I thought because I spoke English that I knew how to teach it. And those of you who are teachers know that that ain't so. But it was a really interesting year. At Christmas time, we went up to the game parks in northern Tanzania and Kenya, and we climbed Kilimanjaro, so I can check that off my bucket list. And then I went home in June of '67, and the world had changed. And I went back to college. I kind of begged and pleaded to let me back so that I could get my degree in a year, and realized that I wanted to teach kids and that maybe I would go back to Africa and teach teachers, and none of that actually happened. I went to graduate school in New York City and got mugged in the South Bronx, which was kind of changed my opinion. Oh, so I have to tell you about the summer before that. My eventually to be husband and I traveled cross country, and I was going to go back to New York to graduate school, and he said he would drive me that far if we could stop in Chicago, because it was the 1968 convention in Chicago. So we were at that catastrophe, sticking stickers on the mirrors in the women's room saying, "Confront the warmongers in Chicago." So I went back to New York to graduate school and decided after I was mugged that I really wanted to move to Santa Fe, which was one of the places we had stopped traveling cross country. And I went out there to teach at a small community school that was one of those new, let the kids do whatever they want and they'll learn and put interesting stuff out and they'll figure out what they want to do. And it was an interesting place to teach, but it had a lot of struggles. I ended up marrying the man I had traveled with, despite having broken up with him 3 times. And we moved, I got pregnant, and we moved out to a little farm in northern New Mexico that had no running water. And we lived there for the year our baby was a baby, and raised goats and chickens, and were part of a movement that was really back to the land. It was a whole thing. There were tons of us out in the hills of New Mexico, and that would have been fine, except my husband was mentally ill, which we didn't understand at that point. We thought it was more about drugs and, because he took whatever anybody gave him, acid and psilocybin and mescaline and God knows what all he had. But he actually was schizophrenic, and nobody understood that at that point what it mattered. So we moved back to town eventually, and I left him and worked in a nursery school for a while with a friend, because my son was, he was 2.5 at that point, and it was great because I could work and take my child. It was like the ideal single mom situation, except that we really didn't make any money. And then we closed the school, sold the building, ended up working for a home health agency for elderly and disabled people, where we tried to keep people in their homes with support and help. And that was a communal organization, and we didn't get paid very much there either. And there I was, a single mom, and I realized that I was going to have to be supporting this child through school and through college. And he was really smart. I didn't realize that he would have gotten full scholarships, but I ended up going to business school in St. Louis so that I could make some money. And when I was in St. Louis, I felt like such a fish out of water in a community of people who were pretty conservative and family-centered, and I was this single mom from a hippie background. And so I ended up with a friend going to a Unitarian church in Kirkland, Missouri, which is right outside St. Louis. Susan Frederick Ray actually went there, but not at the same time I was there. It was interesting when she talked. And that helped me find a community that I really could connect with, because I was working by then for Citibank in St. Louis. Citibank transferred me to Rochester in 1984, 84. And the first thing I did when I got here was go to the Unitarian Church, because I actually also went to the First Universalist Church. But when I went there, they had maybe 10 people in the congregation, and the roof was leaking in the sanctuary. So they were meeting in the fellowship hall. And I thought, oh no, they're going to need me too much. I can't put myself in that position where I'm going to get called on to do stuff. So I came to First Unitarian. And I did it mostly to meet people, because I was a stranger in this community and I didn't know anybody. And one day I turned around in church, and you know how we shake hands, and there was this man with a beard and kind of bald and this great smile. And we talked after church, and we talked and we talked, and then we would talk the next Sunday, and then we'd talk the next Sunday. And he finally invited me out one day to a movie, but he wouldn't even hold my hand. He was very reserved, which you may not know about Bob, those of you who knew Bob. He had this little reserve. What I didn't understand at that point was that he had been in a relationship with somebody for 10 years that was not finished at that point. So come the next fall, he had sort of made his decision, and we became a thing. And in the summer of 87, he rode his bicycle across the country from Los Angeles to Atlantic City. And we were definitely a thing by then. And he asked me to marry him as soon as he got back. And back then we did coming home like rivers to the sea, and brought water, and everybody talked about where they'd been in the summer. Bob gets up in church, he says, I rode my bike across the country. He explained the whole thing. And then he said, you may wonder why I did such a crazy thing, and it's because Libby said if I did, she'd marry me, and I did, and she will. And the whole church just erupted. Dick Gilbert says the things you learn in joys and sorrows, So we did end up getting married, as you probably know, which was a huge blessing. And the church became our home, because we were so connected with each other. And some years later, in 2001, I stood up in Joys and Sorrows, because we were still doing Joys and Sorrows, and said that the daughter that I had given up for adoption had found me, that she had a friend who found somebody on the internet, and she said, well, I just typed in my birth date and there you were, because I had really wanted to find her and had registered. And so she has been my daughter for 19 years now. We celebrate Reunion Day every year on February 10th, and it's just phenomenal, the connection that we have. And the fact that she has dabbled with being a Unitarian Universalist also, although now she's in a different kind of spiritual community. But it's so interesting to me how alike we are in so many ways. And so that spiritual part, it was around then that I started realizing that I wanted much more from church than just the intellectual part. And after Karen and Scott came and Jen was there, we talked to Jen about doing something a little more intense than Soul Matters. And she created Wellspring, which has nourished me and given me purpose in my life for years now. It took me to seminary so that I'm now an interfaith minister ordained. I did spiritual counseling training also through One Spirit. And the work I do is just such a gift, and it never would have happened if I was a banker for 12 years, but it's like, who was that? This is the work that I really care about, and the life that I really care about. So there's 20 minutes, more or less, 75 years as fast as you could go.
Libby, thank you so much. What an incredible life, but what an incredible feat to mash 75 years in about 18 minutes. So much more to hear and to learn, but what a gift and a blessing you've offered us. I'm so grateful.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we can all just take 1 minute to hold Libby and the story that she shared. And then if folks have any questions for Libby or anything you'd like to check in about, if you have a wedding proposal or something that you'd like to share, I'll unmute you. But let's take a minute. Thank you, Libby.